Hello.
Hi.
Our guest is Irena Klepfisz. Irena and we are speaking English,
Yes.
but actually I was wondering what language to speak with you because you in your life experience you went through a lot of languages. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. Well, I was born during the war, and when I became verbal, my first language was Polish. I was placed in a Catholic orphanage on the Aryan side, outside of the Warsaw ghetto, and so I naturally spoke Polish. And when my mother took me away from the orphanage, she continued because she was passing also speaking Polish. And after the war, we moved to Lodz, and we lived communally with other survivors. And a lot of them spoke Yiddish. But my mother continued speaking to me in Polish, and they all knew Polish, so I continued speaking with them in Polish. Sometimes they spoke Yiddish to me, which I understood, but I didn't speak. And then when I was 5, we went to Sweden. And again, we lived in a rather large communal house, and people were speaking Yiddish around me, and some were speaking Polish, and I continued speaking Polish to my mother. But then I was sent to a Swedish school. So I don't know how, but they put me in a classroom, and I learned Swedish. Nobody taught me. I had friends in Swedish. I spoke to them in Swedish, visited their houses. I read, I wrote, and I was the only one in the house who understood Swedish. Nobody else spoke Swedish because everybody knew they were leaving, that it was temporary. And indeed, people left. People left for Canada, Australia, Israel, and we ended up wanting to go to Australia. My mother started learning English when she was still in Sweden, because she was one of 6 siblings. 3 of them were killed in their families during the war, but 2 others survived, one in Siberia and one in Shanghai. And they all went to Australia. So my mother was heading for Australia, and we were in Sweden for 3 years, and we came to New York in 1949 when I was 8. And my mother was convinced by people to stay rather than to continue to Australia. So we got a lawyer, and we got English American citizen, we got the legal status to stay. And I was put into an American school and had to learn English. And so I forgot the Swedish completely within probably 4 or 5 months. And at the same time that I started going to the English school, my mother sent me to a Yiddish afternoon school. So I was going to English during the day, and at night I was going to a Yiddish school. So I was ahead of the other children in Yiddish because I completely understood it, but I couldn't speak it, and I couldn't write or read. I didn't know the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. So that's how I came, and I continued with my mother speaking Polish till I was about 15. There was a lot of pressure at the time from her friends for her to speak with me in Yiddish. A lot of them were very bitter about the experience in Poland, and some of them that were completely fluent in Polish refused to speak Polish again, and they all started speaking Yiddish to each other. There were some who spoke Yiddish before the war and so on. But this became like a political, ideological position. So there was a lot of pressure on my mother to switch to Yiddish, and she didn't, thank God, because I don't think I could have dealt with it. I had enough trouble with the English, switching to English, and I learned how to read and write and speak Yiddish, but I didn't use it very much. With my mother, I continued until I was about 15. Now, the problem was that I didn't read or write, and my vocabulary never expanded. It just stayed sort of like an 8-year-old. That was, if even that much, I'm not sure. So I don't have the vocabulary. If I turn on a Polish movie or I look at a Polish book, I really can't read it. I mean, maybe a little bit, but I can't have a grown-up conversation in Polish. I mean, they have it all the time. You see that half the time I don't understand what they're saying, and some of the time I do. Also, if people speak slowly, I mean, they speak so fast, it's very hard. So that's sort of and English was very difficult for me. I don't know whether Swedish wasn't, and English was extremely difficult for me, but I think it was more psychological because I really didn't want to leave Sweden. I loved my life in Sweden, and when we came here, it was much harder. When we came to the United States, it was just much, much harder. And I think I was very angry. I really wanted to go back. And so it was a resistance, it was a kind of resistance. But eventually I fell in love with literature, and it's sort of, but I still always had, I would say till really, I mean, I'm in my 80s, but I think until my 60s, I don't think I totally felt comfortable in English. I mean, I just somehow never got into it that much.
What about Swedish? Do you sometimes...
No, it was incredible because I just recently found books, my notebooks from Sweden, my Swedish school, were handwritten essays, and also little textbooks. When I was in my, around 20, 21 in college, I had an English teacher who said, we were reading Chaucer, and he said, if you really want to understand Chaucer, go see the Swedish movie, Ingmar Bergman. And what was the first movie? I forgot, the one with the death and chess, how the death plays chess.
Yeah. I also forgot
it was the first Bergman movie that came out. I was very excited because I thought, it was only 10 years. It was a little bit, more, maybe 12 years since I'd been in Sweden. So I thought it would all come back. But when I walked into the movie, I understood nothing. It was like I'd never heard it before. So it just disappeared. I mean, it was, gone.
And the Polish today for you, aside for the difficulties maybe with understanding or speaking?
Yeah, I'm not, I can't read. I mean, I try, but it's very, very slow. And every other word I very often get letters in Polish and I just put it into Google Translate and to see what it is. But I look back, I mean, I try, but it's hard.
And then on an emotional level, it's okay for you to...
yeah, I mean, in fact, when I first met Gabby for the first time in the United States, when somebody introduced her to me, my mother it was in 2017, my mother died in 2016, and she was the last person I spoke Polish with. And when they introduced me to Gabby, she for some reason decided maybe to just try. And she said something to me in Polish, and I just I got so excited because I could speak with someone, because it has a very emotional, it connects with my mother and sort of, and it was so exciting. That was she was surprised. She didn't know whether she should talk to me in Polish, but she was very surprised at my reaction. But I thought it was great. When we talk a lot, I mean, Gabby and I are spending a lot of time together. She's helping me with my partner's paintings. But we always say we're going to try to spend 5 minutes talking Polish. And sometimes we do it, sometimes we don't. But, I enjoy it. I get frustrated when I don't understand it. And I couldn't really, like with the translations, I couldn't really look at them. I mean, sometimes occasionally I would see one word here or something there, but I didn't even really look because I don't know what the nuances are. I don't know what the possible synonyms are that, I see one word in English, if I see one word, I can think of 5 others. In Polish, I'd see one word and it's one word,
Before we go to translation of your poetry, let's talk also about you as the translator. And it's a special day today because the 30th of September is International Translators Day.
Oh, I didn't even know that. Wow.
So now you know, it's also your day. So you are a translator from Yiddish into English, right?
Yeah.
Can you say a few words about that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think my impulse about translating Yiddish had to do with making a whole cultural and a kind of cultural background available to people, to Ashkenazi Jews who came from that background and were totally blocked from the culture by the language. And there was a lot of tension in the Yiddishist community, among the Yiddishists, whether translation was really positive or was it negative, because they thought, well, people should learn Yiddish and then read the original text. My theory was that they should read it in English, become interested in it, and that will lead them to maybe thinking about the original. And that's in fact what happened a lot. I mean, they started getting a feel for it, and then a lot of people started, because enrollment in just language Yiddish classes has been really high, so that people want to see the original. So my idea was, especially, I was particularly interested, as a feminist, I was interested in women intellectuals and women writers and women political figures. So my research during a certain period was about that, and I was interested in translating texts from the Yiddish into English and making it available as it wasn't a literary exercise. I mean, it was really a way of connecting people to that culture that they felt so separate. You know, people have just this shtetl kind of nostalgia, and, you know, it's nothing real. I mean, nostalgia is really bad because it doesn't really tell you the truth. It romanticizes the past. So I wanted them to read the original. I mean, to read at least a translation of the original, to get a better picture of what the background was and what life was like in Eastern Europe before the war.
Which poets particularly interested you?
Well, first of all, I had to research a lot of the poets because I had a lot of Yiddish education. I mean, I went to these afternoon schools, like I said before, but I also went to a Yiddish high school on weekends, which meant I went to school 7 days a week for 4 years. I don't know why they thought up this plan, but I thought it was, and there was a fight with my mother because I didn't want to go a lot of the time. I wanted to stay in bed. And I also did postdoctoral work. After my PhD, I worked at YIVO. I did a postdoctoral program in Yiddish.
I will just make a pause here. Let's maybe explain what YIVO is, because not everybody might be aware.
YIVO is it's translated it's the Yiddische Wissenschaftliche Institut, which technically means Jewish or Yiddish. Yiddish can be translated as Jewish or Yiddish, so depending on how you're using it. So it's the Jewish Institute. The way they do it in English is the Institute of Jewish Research now, which is in New York. It was started in Vilna in the 1920s, and of course it was destroyed partly during the war, but then what was saved was transferred to New York City. So they have a Yiddish program. They had at one point about postdoctoral program, and even I guess an MA program. And so I took that. So my point was that I had all this education, and I couldn't really name, except for maybe Kadia Molodowski, I couldn't name any Yiddish writers. I mean, it was just appalling. I mean, I couldn't name any women writers. I could name Yiddish writers because I was taught that, but I never was given a poem or a story by a woman. So and I didn't believe that they didn't exist, and of course they did. So I started doing research on that. And so I was very particularly zeroed in on that, the women's experience, and that's what started it. And I found Freilich Stock, I found her first collection. Even though I knew Kadia Molodowski, I thought she only wrote poetry, but she wrote fiction, novels, and she was an editor of a major Yiddish journal. Nobody told me. Nobody told me. In New York, I mean, for years, she was the only literary Yiddish journal in New York. Nobody ever mentions it. And so that's what interested me. And I didn't know anything about Rachel Korn, whose poetry I love. I think she's just a wonderful, wonderful and very strong feminist poet. So that was sort of the beginning. And also, they got in touch with me, and I went to see them. I saw the National Yiddish Book Center.
And just a little anecdote, that I was last year. I was in Amherst.
Oh, did you interview?
And so I wanted to go to the Yiddish book center, but I couldn't find it.
You're
because
kidding.
It's because when you're in like from the point of view of European, when you're in America, there it's like, I mean, in that area there were buses, but like every information is for cars. So if you're on foot,
There was no public transportation.
there was a public transportation, but like at the stop where I got off the bus, you had to kind of find the Yiddish book center. And
you didn't have a GPS to point you.
Well, the thing is that when you go from Europe, your internet is not working unless you're on their Wi-Fi. So this is.
I wish I'd known, because I could have probably arranged something.
That's okay. That's for
Anyway,
next time. But maybe let's say about what is actually the.
The National Yiddish Book Center was started by Aaron Lansky probably around 1980. I don't remember the exact date. I went up there in 1982, and at that point they had like a couple of rooms, and they had a huge, I don't know what they call them, and like they're huge containers that they use when they take apart a building and they want to throw everything in and cart it away, of Yiddish books. What Aaron understood at that moment, and the timing was really important, was that there were Yiddish readers who were dying and had nobody to give their libraries to. And so people were throwing stuff out on the street. Somebody would be walking by and they'd see boxes of Yiddish books, because the children didn't know how to read Yiddish, the grandchildren didn't know. So this is like 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And he started collecting them. And he put out calls. If you have Yiddish books, you don't know who to give them to us. And he started very small. When I first went up there, it was like maybe 2 or 3 years old, the whole operation. And at the time, there was a young woman there. I'm going to block her name now.
It's okay.
I will come back. Yeah. I can see her. And she was a graduate. She had just graduated from school. She was like 21, 22. And she was a feminist. So she was putting books aside by women, just by herself on a side. So, and she wrote to me, Sharon Kleinbaum. She became eventually a rabbi. And so Sharon wrote to me, and she said, because she knew I was interested in Yiddish and feminism, she said, Irena, come up there. Come here. I want to show you this. So I go up there. And she's got a shelf full of these books with women's names on them. I mean, it was like, and she just gave them to me, some of them, because they were duplicates and so on. So they started collecting this. They have like a few million books now. It's a whole plant. I'll give you the literature. I brought extras, so I can give you very...
They also, if I'm not wrong, they have a very good digital... access. You can on the internet,
access,
you can listen, right?
You can access the original for free of Yiddish books, which is a gift. I mean, I can look up and all that. They're huge. I mean, they keep expanding it, but they also have a physical plant that is incredible. And I went up there just now. The reason I have the literature is because they did a kind of permanent global Yiddish exhibit, which is all around the inside of the building, and you can spend a day there just walking around. So that's the Yiddish Book Center. They probably have a few million books now.
And they also have an interview with you online, I think, in their database.
Yeah, then they interview anybody that's connected with Yiddish. I mean, you as a translator, if you will get up there, you will get an interview. I will make sure you get an interview to talk about why you're interested in Yiddish, you know. So that's how I don't remember what I was saying, but that's how I received my first books of women I'd never heard of. I mean, I heard of Kadia Molodowski, but suddenly Sharon gave me all these books.
So let's say that again, because it sounds unbelievable. So basically, it's like all those books would have been thrown out, basically.
Exactly. That's what Aaron, realized that there was a generation of Yiddish readers and speakers who were dying, who had no heirs, basically. Their children didn't know Yiddish, their grandchildren didn't know Yiddish, the local library certainly didn't want the books. Throw them out. And he made a call, and there was a whole slew. It was very interesting. They were called Sammlers. In Yiddish, the word is Sammlers, which means collectors. There were Sammlers who didn't know a single word of Yiddish, but went out and got the books. I mean, they became committed. I mean, it was a very interesting phenomenon because they realized how important it was to save it. It would have all gone. So he saved millions and millions of books. There were dozens and dozens and dozens, and people were shipping these books. I'm in the same position now. A lot of my books came from the National Yiddish Book Center. I have no one to give them to. The people that I know Yiddish have these books. They have the same books I have. But I have no one to pass them on to, and I suspect what's going to happen in the next couple of years is I'm going to ship them right back to the National Yiddish Book Center. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an interesting, it's almost like they were on loan. They didn't intend it to be on loan, but it feels like I'm going to send them back.
So you translated poetry of Yiddish, but you're also a poet yourself. And also Yiddish has, even though you write in English, but Yiddish has a special place in your poetry. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, and it came late because I published 2 full books with no Yiddish at all. It came partly as I don't know, I talked about, did I read Umschlagplatz last night? I don't think I did.
You did.
I did. I can't remember what I read when.
You did.
It came out partly out of the trip in '83 when I came here. In the Lodge Cemetery, I sort of had an epiphany. I think it was the first time that I sort of thought the Holocaust wasn't only personal, because the Holocaust to me meant missing relatives or missing friends, and it was the same thing for my friends who were children of the Holocaust. When I went to Lodge in that cemetery, I realized it was a whole society. I mean, it was like beyond my immediate whatever. And at the same time, like I said yesterday, I think in the women's movement, there was this kind of push to get in touch with your community of origin, which for me was Yiddish speakers and Yiddish intellectuals. And so a friend of mine who was a Chicana, a Mexican-American from Texas, she was also a lesbian, we were together sort of comrades. She wrote bilingually in English and Spanish. And we spent a couple of summers together teaching, and so we had a lot of conversations about language. And when she heard about my background, about Yiddish, she said, how come there's no Yiddish in your writing? Because she did everything in multilingual. You know, she did English, Spanish, and she didn't translate the Spanish, which we had big arguments about. And so she didn't push me to do Yiddish, but she said, isn't this strange that you never sort of... And together with the trip and conversations with Gloria, I suddenly thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Why don't I use Yiddish? I don't know. It's never appeared, except for Basher, the one word. And I sort of challenged myself to see. I knew I didn't want to write in Yiddish. I mean, English was so difficult for me that once I felt secure in English, I wasn't going to go anywhere else. So, but I didn't want to completely disassociate myself. So I tried experimenting, sort of doing some bilingual material, and it worked. I thought it worked for me anyway, about how I could incorporate it into some poetry, not all poetry. But I also wanted, for a lot of Jews that came from Yiddish-speaking families, they didn't understand Yiddish at all. They didn't know Yiddish because the parents made Yiddish a secret language, because the parents would discuss things that they didn't want the children to know anything about, so the kids never learned Yiddish. But when I was using Yiddish, I wanted everybody to understand it. I didn't want to do that. I was very, very clear that I wanted my Yiddish to be accessible. So I had to figure out how to do it so that either they would understand it in context, or maybe I would parallel. I had to figure out there's different ways of doing that, but it was very important to me that the reader could understand it, even if they didn't know any Yiddish.
So here we are in 2024, and this year it's a first full publication of your works in Polish, right? It's a book that has been published by the Polish publishing house Słowo I Terytoria, and it's a bilingual book. It's called In Between Worlds, Pomiędzy, światami. So there is the English original and the Polish translations. So I was one of the translators of your texts. And how is it for you to see your poems in Polish?
Well, it's very strange. I mean, it's not, it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I think, well, for one thing, let me just say this, that I dedicated the book to my mother. And my mother, she was a remarkable woman in many ways. I think the way we would put it in modern English is that she reinvented herself over and over and over again. She had different names at different times. So she was originally Shoshana, which was her Hebrew name when she was born. And then she became Ruszka for her Polish name. Then my father called her Mała because she was very short and he was very tall. Then during the war, she had an Aryan name, which was Lodja, which stuck with some people. Some people called her for the rest of her life Lodja. Then we lived with a little boy who couldn't say Lodja, so she became Mama Law. And then we came to the United States and she became Rose, and I called her Mamashi. So she...
Which means kind of mother, right?
Mother,
in
but
Yiddish.
it's sort of very Yiddish,
It's
a little
very
bit...
sweet.
Yeah, it's sort of babyish. It's very babyish. So I dedicated the book to her, and I wrote that to my mother, whose first love was Polish literature. And that's really true. I mean, my mother had to go to work when she was 12, and she loved literature from a very young age. Always read. When she had to get certain kinds of jobs, she got them around books. She volunteered in libraries. This is just before the war. And she always just pushed me to read, to make sure I had a library card, made sure I went and got books at the library. When I was in graduate school, she read all the Victorian fiction that I read for my degree. The best gift I could ever give her is a book. I mean, it was the best gift. So the book's dedicated to her. So I have to say it's kind of bittersweet that she hasn't seen the book. You know, I feel kind of sad about it because I think she would have been really, really... She wasn't that impressed with me as a writer. She was kind of... Well, she was proud, but this, I think, would have been... Because Polish literature for her was, I mean, she still could recite Mickiewicz. I mean, she would recite in Polish Pantadeusz. I mean, it was like remarkable. So it's strange. One of the things that I found really interesting, and I've experienced this, is that I really like the Yiddish and the Polish more than I like the Yiddish and the English, because I feel it's a more natural fit. Somehow, I'm not sure, but it just sounds different to me. I like it. I like hearing it. I like hearing the Polish again alongside the Yiddish somehow. That to me, it sounds more together than the English and the Yiddish somehow. The English and the Yiddish, as much as I try to get them to fit, it still feels a little bit on the edge. Whereas in Polish, it feels kind of natural almost. I don't know, maybe it's just my own psyche, I don't know.
Or maybe it's partly also that like 80 years ago, on the street of Warsaw, you could hear Polish, Yiddish, Hebrew, sometimes mixed together.
Yeah, that's why I think, and see with the English, it was always kind of, when Yiddish and English blended, it was very corrupt English. It was sort of greenhorn kind of English. And people made fun of it. The accent was made fun of in English, you know. And to me, maybe that's my nostalgia. I don't know. There's a much more of a complementary sort of enfolded feeling about the Yiddish and the Polish. So that's a kind of interesting. Surprised me the first time I heard it. Remember when they had the reading at JCC? Was like 4 or 5 years ago. Remember they read it then they read it a second time. I mean, it was really interesting. I thought it went so well together as opposed to the English.
I will just explain for our listeners that JCC is the Jewish Community Center, because, and I was caught when you said to reinvent yourself when you were talking about your mother. But would you say that maybe this has also been your experience? I mean. You have so many how to say, roles maybe, or like translator, poet, academic teacher, peace activist, queer activist, feminist activist.
The difference, I think, with my mother was that I don't feel like I reinvented myself, but I do feel my mother went through stages where some of those names were dominant. Do you know what I mean? And then they were dropped, and then she began. What I feel is that I felt my process has been a kind of reintegration of a number of things, not as, I don't think of them as separate. Like, it's very interesting thing about, for example, I read the poem yesterday about grief and that episode with the immigrant in the library in Maine. So, there's nothing there Jewish, there's nothing there lesbian. So, okay, there's nothing there even necessarily feminist, though it says it's about women. So what's that poem? I mean, is it a Jewish poem? Is it a lesbian poem? It's maybe, I would put that poem anywhere. I would put it in a Jewish anthology, I would put it in a lesbian anthology, I would put it in an English, American literature anthology. So to me, it doesn't feel that, even though we have to make a list, and even though I say none of these are the dominant, you have to still make a list and start with the first one and end with the last one, right? But you don't want that to be a value judgment. You want it to be all at once, you know?
One last question I would like to ask is about the words in Yiddish. I don't know Yiddish, but there are a few words, and one that I particularly love is Mameloshen. Am I saying it right? Like
yes,
mother tongue?
Yeah, mother tongue, Mameloshen.
Are there any words you like in Yiddish especially?
No. I mean, it's really interesting. Most people assume that my Mameloshen is Yiddish and my Mameloshen is Polish. It's not Yiddish at all. So, no, when I wrote that particular poem about the kurva and all of that, I was thinking of it as a critique, actually, of Yiddish, and that I didn't want to just embrace Yiddish with this nostalgic, oh, it was all so beautiful, or that culture. It was, in fact, quite sexist and patriarchal. So no, I don't have an answer for that.
It's okay. So I think these are all my questions. And so I encourage everybody to read poetry, either Polish, English, or...
Absolutely. I think we need it at this time. I think it's a greatly needed moments of sanity that poetry can bring you, and it's very, very bad moments in history that we're going through. So I think it's not about my poetry, but just in general. I think it gives you some. I think it energizes. I think it gives you some measure of rejuvenation to stop for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And poetry can be very. I don't know if it can heal, but I think it can analyze. It can remind you what you're fighting for. So yeah, I encourage, buy poetry books. Buy one poetry book a month. I tell people that.
So we have been talking about poetry, and we had this great idea to ask Irena to read one of her poems. And this is a special poem because it has some Yiddish words in it. And I will ask Irena to read it in English, but you can also find it in Polish in the book. It has been translated into Polish by Bella Schwarzman-Czarnota.
Okay, this is the first bilingual poem that I ever wrote, and it's called Etliche Wörter auf Mameloshen, a few words in the mother tongue. Lemoshel, for example, die Kurve, the whore, a woman who acknowledges her passions. Die Yidine, the Jewish woman, ignorant, overbearing. Let's face it, every woman is one. Die Yente, the gossip, the busybody who knows what's what and is never caught off guard. Die Lesbianke, the one with a roommate, though we never use the word. Das Weibel, the wife or the little woman. In Daheim, where she does everything to keep Yiddishkeit alive, Yiddishkeit a way of being Jewish, always arguable. in Mark, where she buys die Kartoffel und Challah. Yes, potatoes and challah, die Kartoffel, the material counterpart of Yiddishkeit. Mit Sibylis, with onions, that bring Tränen zu die Augen, tears to her eyes when she sees how little it all is. Weniger und weniger, less and less. Die Halle, braided wie ihr Haar vor der Hasana, like her hair before the wedding when she was a Zashen Mädel, such a pretty girl. Die lange schwarze Haar, the long black hair, die lange schwarze Haar. A Frau cholmt, a woman dreams ihr Ort auf der Welt, her place in this world, und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid, so afraid of the words Kurve, Jidene, Jente, Lesbianke, Weibel. Sie cholmt, she dreams, und sie hat Meure, and she is afraid, ihr Ort, die Welt, die Heim, der Mark. A Mädel cholmt, a Kurve cholmt, a Jidene cholmt, a Jente cholmt, a Lesbianke cholmt, a Weibel cholmt, die Kartoffel, die Challah, Yiddishkeit, sie cholmt, die Haar, die lange schwarze Haar, sie cholmt, sie cholmt, sie cholmt.
How we say thank you in Yiddish?
Oh, Ashenim Dank.
Ashenim Dank.
Ashenim Dank. Dziękuję bardzo.
Merci beaucoup.